Hello everyone, thank you for joining me here today for my project of Alexander the Great. This is my project for my History 101 Western Civilization class under the instruction of Professor George Medianis for the fall semester of 2022. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few key terms. The first one we have is BCE. Now this is an abbreviation of before the Common Era. And before scholars did change it to this more appropriate term, BCE was typically marked at the time period before the birth of the Christian mythological figure Jesus Christ, but it was changed to the Common Era or before the Common Era, and we do have an example of a timeline. So for example, BCE would be before the birth of Jesus Christ, and as you get farther into the future, the number of the date does go down. So be 3 BCE, 210, which will be marked by the birth of Jesus Christ, and then we enter the Common Era. And as we go further into the future, the number does rise as we know it today. And we also have R. When placed before a set of dates, this typically means reign or reigned. For example, we have John Smith. He reigned from 567 BCE to 432 BCE. Now this is of course an exaggerated example, but I hope it does offer you a good view on it. And we also have circa, which is placed as C before a set of dates, and this means approximately. So for example, Jane Doe, approximately, or circa 987 BCE to 876 BCE. Now, who was Alexander? First, here are some names or aliases for Alexander. He was born Alexander III, but he is most commonly referred to as Alexander the Great or Alexander of Macedonia. Now over here we have a picture of a sculpture of Alexander. This was made by a Polish artist, Victor Browacki. Alexander was first and foremost the Emperor of Macedonia. He ruled from the year 336 BCE to the year 323 BCE, so he only ruled for about 13 years. And over here we have an image of an old coin. This coin is actually a gold slater depicting Alexander III. A slater is a form of currency from the era. Alexander was a renowned conqueror. This is what he is mostly known for in history. And here is a map of Alexander's empire by artist Peter Hermes Furen. As you can see, it is very large, especially when you consider the time. And we have to keep in mind, he was able to accomplish this in only 13 years. Now the route he took, he of course started out in Pella in Macedonia. He was able to cross his way through the Greek area, enter the Persian Empire, and snake his way down through Egypt. He's then able to bring his way back up to the northern portion of Mesopotamia and down into the Babylon area. He then reached Persepolis and then went northward and then headed east to then go through India. He then was able to go back down to the southern area of India through the subcontinent and make his way back home. So, how did he do it? First, we have to take a look at his background. This is a simplified depiction of his family tree. Now, Alexander was fathered by Philip II. Philip was the emperor before Alexander. He was also a successful conqueror, but we'll see later on that the son did in fact outdo the father. And Philip married Olympias, who birthed and mothered Alexander. Olympias was the daughter of the king of Epirus. Unfortunately, Philip and Olympias did not have the best marriage, but at least their offspring did turn out okay. Later on, we'll talk about Alexander and his marriage between Roxanne, also referred to as Roxana, and she was the daughter of a Sogdian lord, and so she is referred to as a Bactrian princess. We'll also talk about their offspring, Alexander IV. Now, a little fun fact I did want to include is Alexander the Great believed he was descended from Hercules and Achilles. It would be Hercules on his father's side and Achilles on his mother's side. Now, a little more background. Union of Philip II and Olympias. Philip II and Olympias were married in 357 BCE. Now, Philip was born in 382 BCE, and Olympias was born in 375 BCE. So, Philip II was 25 when he married his fourth wife, Olympias, and Olympias was 18 at the time of their marriage. Alexander was born in July of 356 BCE, so a year after his parents were married. He was born in Pella, a Macedonian city that was quickly becoming a large center for the kingdom. Now over here we do have an image depicting Alexander's birth chart if you're into that kind of thing. And I did find it quite interesting how, if you see here, he is actually a Cancer. So if he was like me, he may have let his emotions get the best of him. So we'll see if that takes place later on in his accomplishments. In Alexander's youth, he tamed a horse that he named Bucephalus. Now over here we do have an image titled Alexander Mastering Bucephalus by Leon Devant. He tamed the horse in circa 344 BCE, so he was only about 12 years old at the time. Bucephalus actually means ox head in Greek, which is quite befitting. No one else was able to ride the horse, and no one else was brave enough to even attempt to mount the horse, including Alexander's father, Philip II. Alexander and Philip always had a competitive relationship, and Alexander made a wager with his father. He claimed that he could in fact tame the horse and ride it and stay astride. When Alexander returned to his father while mounted on Bucephalus, Philip was very proud of him and said the following: "You must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." Philip II. Ever since his youth, Alexander had always been interested in the tales of heroes and warriors. It was said he had known the writings of Homer and Euripides by heart. His favorite was the Iliad by Homer, and he had always slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. His favorite line from the Iliad was, "Ever to be the best and stand above all others." His favorite character and/or role model was Achilles. Alexander looked up to him for his skill and bravery. Alexander was also partial to Achilles because of their relation on his mother's side. Over here I do have an image titled Scene from the Iliad. Now, as we had previously mentioned, Alexander and Philip II always had a competitive relationship. It is rumored that Alexander had complained to his companions about his father and said this: "My father will forestall me in everything. There will be nothing great or spectacular for you and me to show the world." Even though they were really competitive, Philip was very proud of Alexander at first, but the relationship strained as Alexander grew older. Philip often mistreated Alexander's mother, Olympias. Alexander absolutely loved his mother, and he did not support Philip's behavior towards her. Alexander often fantasized about the idea of his true parentage. He hoped that Philip was not his real father, and that he was actually a son of the gods. Olympias was known for encouraging his fantasy because she did not want her son to feel like he was going to be a king one day just because he was a son of Philip. No, she wanted Alexander to feel like a king in his own right. By the time Alexander was 13, Philip decided it was time for Alexander to expand on his education, and he hired the famous philosopher Aristotle. Now over here we do have an image titled Aristotle, so it does give us an idea of what the gentleman looked like. From circa 343 BCE to 340 BCE, Alexander was under the teachings of Aristotle, so he was 13 years old to 16 years old. Alexander studied with other boys from the Macedonian aristocracy as well, and they are referred to as the School of Pages. They would study and hold their lessons in the Mieza Temple, which was only 30 kilometers, or a little over 18.5 miles, from the royal palace in Pella. Among the students at the School of Pages were a few of Alexander's friends. Hephaestion, who was his closest friend and lover, Cassander, Epitome. They would study the arts and sciences as well as learn about debate and drama. The students learned how to be proficient orators, which helped them in their careers later on. Alexander developed a fascination with medicine, botany, and zoology. And then Philip II decided it was a good idea to take on another wife. His new wife was younger than Alexander, and she became pregnant. Alexander's succession is now threatened because his mother was originally a princess of Epirus, while Philip's new wife was of pure Macedonian nobility. To apply salt in the wound further, Philip renames his new wife Eurydice, after his mother who was beloved by all. This is seen as an insult to Olympias, who was the queen mother-to-be. At the wedding, Eurydice's uncle, Attalus, who was a companion of Philip's, toasted to the happy couple by saying he hopes his niece will give birth to a legitimate heir. Now Alexander was known for having a temper, and he had already started drinking heavily at a young age. He responded to Attalus by hurling his cup at him and saying, "Villain, do you take me for a bastard, then?" Of course, Attalus responded by throwing his own cup, and a full-on brawl broke out. Naturally, this angered Philip. He stood up and drew his sword and lunged at Alexander. Unfortunately for him, he was drunk, and instead of impaling Alexander, he tripped and fell on his face. Alexander then had the audacity to say, "Look, men, here's the man who is making ready to cross from Europe to Asia, and who cannot even cross from one table to another without losing his balance." Obviously, this caused a rift in the family, and Alexander and his mother Olympias fled to Epirus. After a while, Alexander and Philip reconciled, but they never fully trusted each other again after that, and Alexander's succession was still threatened by the existence of Eurydice. More family drama emerges when the satrap of Caria in the Persian Empire tries to marry his daughter off to Aridaeus, Alexander's intellectually disabled half-brother and Philip's son. In doing so, Alexander was worried Philip would make Aridaeus his successor. At this point, Philip's new wife, Eurydice, gave birth to a daughter, but she became pregnant again. To try to secure his rule, Alexander secretly planned to marry the satrap's daughter himself. Before the plan is carried out, Philip finds out and he places Alexander under house arrest, banishes most of his friends from the kingdom, and threatens to divorce Olympias, whom he suspected encouraged the plot. Philip then offers his daughter Cleopatra's hand in marriage to the king of Epirus, who is Olympias's brother. Cleopatra is also Olympias's daughter, so that makes the king of Epirus her uncle. Now, we are not talking about the Cleopatra of Egypt. This is in fact a different Cleopatra. The king of Epirus accepted the offer, and Olympias was no longer needed to secure peace between Macedonia and Epirus. In honor of the happy couple, Philip decides to throw a festival for their wedding. As Philip was entering the theater where the opening ceremony was going to be held, the captain of his bodyguard, Pausanias, stabbed him in the heart. Pausanias was a Macedonian nobleman who had a grievance with Eurydice's uncle, Attalus, and with Philip. It is rumored Philip and Pausanias were lovers, and Philip replaced Pausanias with someone else. Many speculate Olympias and/or Alexander had something to do with the assassination, saying how they had the most to gain from Philip's death. No one ever really found the truth. With the death of one king, another rises. Immediately following the death of Philip II, Alexander III was crowned the new king of the Macedonian Empire in circa 336 BCE. Alexander was no more than 20 years old at the time. He gave a speech to his people and assured them that it would be as though his father was still in rule. The only difference would be the name. He then had those convicted of involvement in the assassination of his father executed. Alexander did not think it was wise to replace the experienced officers of state with younger and inexperienced men, so he kept the old officers from his father's reign in command, which was unusual at the time. And over here we have an image titled "The Head of Alexander the Great" to give us an image of what he may have looked like at the time of his inauguration. To secure his rule, Alexander then executed any other competitors for the throne, including his cousin Amenidas, who Philip had usurped before he had the throne. The only person he spared was his intellectually disabled half-brother Aridaeus. Olympias wanted to hop on the killing one enemy's bandwagon also. Eurydice's second child was a son, and it is said Olympias killed both of Eurydice's children in front of her and then forced her to hang herself. Like his father, Alexander also wanted to expand eastward into Asia. Before starting his campaign, he wanted to visit the oracle of Delphi. The oracle could not see him at the time, but Alexander was impatient and refused to wait. She gave in to his demands and said, "You are invincible, my son." Alexander believed in the power and knowledge of oracles and took this as a good omen for his rule. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, which is now called the Dardanelles, and headed towards Asia with 30,000 foot soldiers and 5,000 cavalry. 14,000 of those men were Macedonian, and 7,000 of them were from the allied Greek League. Now over here we have a map that shows us the Turkey-Greece area that does show the Dardanelles Strait, which is right here. So, of course, Alexander had to make his way down through Macedonia to this peninsula and cross this body of water, which was an extraordinary feat at the time. Alexander's main opponent was King Darius III of Persia. Persia was not a small empire, and they had more troops than Alexander. Because of this, Darius was a worthy opponent for the young Alexander. Keep in mind, Alexander was only 22 in 334 BCE. When Alexander was away, he left Antipater as his deputy in Europe. Antipater was a general and close friend of Philip II's, and Alexander kept him on his council. In 333 BCE, Alexander and the king of the Persian Empire, Darius III, met at the Battle of Issus. By this time, Alexander was already making his way through the Persian territory and had already defeated many Persian satraps. Darius had more men than Alexander. Many historians believe the difference could have been as great as 10 to 1. However, the Persian force was no match against Alexander's military intelligence. A great advantage for Alexander was his cavalry and the military formation called a phalanx. A phalanx is a group of soldiers who are clustered close together with their shields and long-range weapons such as spears. Darius saw that he was losing the battle and was frightened by the phalanx that was approaching the front lines. He turned his chariot away from the fight and retreated. With his retreat, his force could not reorganize or rally together. Thus, the battle was won. Now Darius was so confident that he was going to win that he thought it was a great idea to bring his whole family. Like I said before, Darius retreated, and in doing so, he left his family behind. He left his mother, wife, and his children. As the victor, Alexander entered the Persian king's tent to find it was filled with luxuries. It is reported that Alexander lived in Spartan conditions just like his troops. When he saw what was in the tent, he made a further jab towards Darius. He said, "So this, it seems, is what it means to be a king." Alexander treated the royal family well and had them learn Greek and Greek customs to further their education. Alexander's goal and vision was to unite the world under one ruler, and the spreading of languages and cultures is one way he tried to help this goal. Here is a beautiful mural depicting the retreat of the Persian king Darius III. It is titled, "The Battle at Issus in 333 BC. Alexander the Great of Macedonia is chasing the fleeing Darius III." Alexander continued onward and came to the island city of Tyre, which was just off the coast of the mainland. When he got there, he asked the people of Tyre to make a sacrifice to Melkort, who he equivalated to Heracles, better known as Hercules, the same figure he claims to be related to, but the people refused. Alexander would have continued moving forward, but he was worried about an attack from behind. He then built a bridge from the mainland to the island, and after a 7-month-long siege, he launched a naval battle and stormed the city of Tyre in July of 332 BCE. In retaliation, he crucified 2,000 Tyrian fighters and sold women and children into slavery. He was angry because they would not make a sacrifice to his ancestor, and they murdered his Macedonian envoys who were sent to negotiate peace before the siege began. Here we have an image titled, "Alexander Attacking Tyre from the Sea, from the Deeds of Alexander the Great," by Antonio Tempesta. During the siege of Tyre, Darius III sent a letter to Alexander offering him 10,000 talents in exchange for his family, and he offered all of his lands west of the Euphrates River. To put it in perspective, the currency system at this time was based on weight for measurement. A talent weighed 75 pounds or 35 kilograms. That's 750,000 pounds. Now if we assume the talents are made of gold, a pound of gold today is worth $25,014. Times that by 750,000 pounds, that would be $18,760,500,000 in today's currency. Alexander's general, Parmenion, urged Alexander to take this deal. He expressed so by saying, "I would accept if I were Alexander." And Alexander so famously retorted, "That is what I should do were I Parmenion." Alexander and his forces continue on towards Egypt. They arrive in Egypt in the autumn of 332 BCE, and the Persian satrap in that territory surrendered without a fight. The Egyptian people welcomed Alexander and saw him as a deliverer from the Persians. They crowned Alexander as a pharaoh in Memphis. They loved him because he was tolerant of their religion, while the Persians were not. While Alexander was making plans for his new city, Alexandria, he decided to go on a 370-mile trek through the desert to see the oracle of Ammon. The oracle told him he was a son of Zeus. All of his life, Alexander had hoped he was not the son of Philip II, and that he was a son of the gods. He returned to Egypt and established his capital city, Alexandria, near the Egyptian coast. This city would become a large center of education and commerce. On October 1st, 331 BCE, in the northern regions of Mesopotamia, Alexander the Great waged yet another battle against Darius III, king of Persia, except this time he fought as a son of Zeus. It is said Alexander had prayed to the gods and asked him for victory, if he is in fact his son. The Persians may have had scythed chariots and outnumbered the Macedonians 6-1, but they were no match for Alexander. The Battle of Gaugamela was won and Darius escaped once again. Alexander did not pursue Darius. He didn't need to. Darius III was murdered a year later in 330 BCE in Hecatompylos. Here we have a picture depicting the defeat of Darius III. It is titled Disfatia di Dario, which translates the defeat of Darius. At the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander made his way to Babylon, who surrendered, and then Susa, who did the same. By midwinter, Alexander and his men made their way to the Persian capital, Persepolis. After looting the royal treasury, Alexander ordered his men to sack the city. It is unknown as to why he ordered the destruction of the city, but there have been speculations. If legend is true, Alexander sacked the city after the suggestion had been made by a drunk courtesan. More logically, it may have been retribution for the sacrilege against the Greek gods done by the Persians on previous conquests in Greece, or because the Persians were uneager to accept him as their new ruler. Some scholars believe it may have been to satisfy and to pay off his men because the destruction and looting of cities was discouraged up to that point. No matter the reason, this finalized the destruction of the Persian Empire. Perhaps it was due to his love and respect for history, but Alexander ordered his men to leave the monuments untouched, especially the tomb of Cyrus. Alexander admired the great king and did not want to disrespect him or his memory. Alexander even made it a point to visit the tomb out of respect. Alexander turned northward and made his way through the lands of Bactria and Sogdiana. He then made his way east to India. Alexander had 3 wives in his lifetime. In the spring of 327 BCE, Alexander married his first wife, Roxanne, or Roxana, of Bactria, the daughter of a Sogdian lord, Oxyartes. The marriage did gain the support of her father, but it is reported that she was the second loveliest woman in all of Asia, second only to the wife of Darius III. And it is said Alexander had fallen in love with Roxanne upon the first time seeing her. In the summer of 327 BCE, Alexander and his men made their way across the Hindu Kush into the Indus Valley. When they arrived at the river Hydaspes in 326 BCE, they came face to face with the force of the Indian king Poros. What they were not prepared for was his herd of 200 elephants. The horses in the Macedonian cavalry were afraid of the elephants and were rendered useless. But in the end, King Poros was defeated. This victory opened up an entrance to the vast subcontinent of India. Over here we have an image titled Alexander the Great. It depicts Alexander astride an elephant. One thing that can be said and possibly admired about Alexander was he knew he was not always right and didn't know everything, but he was always willing to adapt and learn new tactics for success. Shortly after the Battle of Hydaspes, Alexander's warhorse and companion, Bucephalus, died from old age and exhaustion. No one is sure, but his demise may have also been credited to injury suffered in battle, but most likely it was due to old age. Alexander founded the city, Bucephalia, in his honor. The beginning of the end. Alexander and his men continued on and reached the easternmost of the great river systems, the Hyphasis river system. When they reached the Bees River, Alexander's men refused to continue. At this point, they were exhausted, and nothing, including plundering, motivated them. They also did not share Alexander's views. Alexander wanted to unite all cultures and lands under one ruler, but his men did not believe others were equal to the Macedonian culture. One calculation was done by Count York von Wartenberg. The Macedonian troops had traveled 12,000 miles, or 19,000 kilometers, in 8.5 years. Alexander tried to motivate them with a speech, but it did not work. His general, Conus, shouted, "There is one thing above all others a successful man should know. It is when to stop." The men shouted and cheered an agreement. Alexander was angry and tried to shame his men. He said they were leaving their king in enemy territory and that he would go on alone. Like the great Achilles from the Iliad, Alexander retreated to his tent and hoped his men would change their minds. But after 3 days, he realized he had no choice but to go back home. To keep up a strong appearance with his men, Alexander organized a celebration which included equestrian and athletic games. He then ordered the construction of 12 gigantic altars on the banks of the Bees River to mark the easternmost limit of his empire. They then erected a brass obelisk and inscribed the simple words, "Alexander stopped here." Now, if you are like me and you had no idea what an obelisk was, think of the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. That tall, pointed tower-like structure is called an obelisk, and it is what they made out of brass at the time. Alexander retreated via a route that would allow him to conquer all of southern India. Alexander and his men returned to the city of Susa in 324 BCE. Shortly after, Alexander's right-hand man, friend, and lover, Hephaestion, died of high fever. As a gesture of mourning, Alexander shaved his head and ordered the manes and tails of the horses and mules to be cut as well. After a grand funeral and a period of mourning, Alexander tried to numb the pain by a 40-day campaign against a nearby tribe that did not want to submit to Alexander. Alexander and Hephaestion's relationship was seen as odd, not because of its homoerotic nature, but because of their age. They had been together since their days studying under Aristotle. Culturally, a young man would have an older lover, and that the older lover would replace them with someone younger as they grew up. And in turn, the younger lover would take on a younger lover themselves as they grow and become an older partner. But not Alexander and Hephaestion. They had stayed together until death. In the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon. By this time, Alexander and his men had traveled 20,000 miles in about 10 years. It was still Alexander's dream to combine Europe and Asia as one country, and he wanted to make Babylon its capital. He was preparing a naval force to start an Arabian campaign to gain a hold around the Persian Gulf. He received multiple bad omens, but ignored them all. By May, he was sick with a high fever. One of his Macedonian officers had sat at his bedside and asked Alexander who he was going to leave his empire to. Alexander whispered, "Hote to Chrasisto," which means "to the best." Later on, others argue Alexander really said "to the strongest," but the word Kratisto and Kratero are so similar. Alexander III of Macedonia died on June 10th, 323 BCE, just before his 33rd birthday. Roxanne was pregnant with Alexander's first child, Alexander IV, at the time of his death, but he was not born until a month later. Alexander's empire was split amongst 3 of his generals, and to secure their rule, Olympias, the mother of Alexander, was murdered in 316 BCE, and a few years later, Roxanne and Alexander IV were murdered in 310 BCE. With this, Alexander's line had fallen. Here we have an image titled Engraving of Alexander the Great by Justin Lesieux, and this may have been an image around the time of his demise. Now we do have a few citations. This is the first page of the image citations. You will find the title of the image, and if provided, the artist of the image, as well as a slide where you can find the information. And here, this is the second page of the works cited images continued. Again, the title of the image, and if provided, the name of the artist, as well as the slide where you may find the image. And continued, we have the third works cited page of images. And this is the fourth and final page of the works cited images. Again, the title of the image, if provided, the artist, of course the citation, and the slide number in which you may find the image provided. Now we continue on with the works cited, but this is now the written portion. Provided, we have the title of the piece, as well as the author, the citation itself, and the slide numbers in which you may find the information that was used for the information provided on the slide and/or verbal. We have this slide as well to continue the written portion of the work cited. Again, we have the title of the piece, the author, the citation itself, as well as the slide number, where the information was used on the slide and/or verbally. I would like to thank you all for staying with me to the end of this presentation, and I hope that you were able to gather valuable information either for your own research or for your own personal interest on Alexander the Great. Again, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.